So it's now 1 p.m. here in California, and we're going to go into panel 3, the growing shadow debt, how states can act now to address institutional debt. You've been hearing a lot about this topic, institutional debt, throughout the day so far. So this is the time we're going to go into a deep dive. So to get us started, I will hand it off to my friend colleague, Sara from Young Invincibles. Sara is entering the webinar. Sara, do we have you on the line?
Yes.
All right, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you to Next Gen Policy for hosting us on their platform today for the Free My Future Summit. We're really excited to be here with all of you today. Just a little recap on Free My Future Summit if you're just joining us for this panel. Free My Future Summit has been an ongoing summit. It's the first time we're hosting it since the pandemic, so we're really excited to have everyone here with us. Our panel today that will be sitting with you on for the next 50 minutes, hour or so, is around the growing shadow debt, how states can act now to address institutional debt. This panel will feature a few speakers who I will introduce in a second, but just to go over what the panel is going to be about, we'll be addressing the institutional debt crisis in California. Currently, right now in California, more than 3.9 million borrowers owe $148 billion in student loan debt. However, beyond that, beyond the work that's been done around student loan debt, another type of debt that is continuously being accrued by California students is institutional debt. And this debt is a type of debt that students owe directly to their school. And there are a few protections when it comes to alleviating and mitigating this type of student debt. I will go over our amazing lineup of speakers today. We have Samantha Seng, who is from Next Gen Policy. Samantha Seng covers education policy, early childhood, K through 12th grade, and higher education for Next Gen Policy. The work includes advocating for policies and programs that promote access, equity, and student success at every stage of their educational career. Samantha joined Next Gen after a stint in the California State Assembly, working on a wide range of issues for several different elected officials. Before moving to Sacramento, Samantha came from the nonprofit sector, teaching, mentoring, and tutoring low-income and at-promise youth throughout the Bay Area. Samantha is a proud daughter of immigrants, a first-generation college graduate, and the first family member to hold a master's degree in education from Lesley University. Samantha holds an undergraduate degree from UC Berkeley. Thank you so much for joining us, Sam. Next in our panel, we have Professor Jonathan Glader, who joined the Berkeley Faculty Law in 2021. His research has focused on the ways that law promotes and limits access to education, especially higher education, and the impact that education debt has on educational opportunities. Recent publications include Qualified Sovereignty, Pandemic Possibilities, Rethinking Measures of Merit, and the Civil Rights Case for Student Debt Reform. He is also a co-author with Amy Gajda on a casebook, The Law and Higher Education, Cases and Materials on Colleges in Court. Courses taught include education law and policy, criminal law, and disability law. Glader is a faculty director of the Center on Consumer Law and Economic Justice at Berkeley Law. With Dali Jimenez, he is also a co-founder and co-director of the Student Loan Law Initiative, an interdisciplinary partnership with the Student Borrower Protection Center devoted to the study on the effects of student debt. In 2023, he was named a member of the California Civil Rights Council, a volunteer body tasked with developing regulations that implement California's civil rights laws. He also serves as a co-chair of the New York City Bar Association's Committee on Education and Law. Welcome, Professor Glader. And finally, last but not least, we have Aisa Canchola Banez, who is a policy director at the Student Borrower Protection Center. She brings a decade of experience in Congress, executive agencies, and advocacy working to advance policy solutions to improve the lives of workers and families and create a more just and equitable society. Prior to joining SBPC, she served as Deputy Chief of Staff and Legislative Director for Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, where she led the Congresswoman's policy work, including efforts to protect borrowers and make student loan debt cancellation a reality. Previously, Aissa led outreach and engagement efforts for the Office for Students and Young Consumers at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And prior to joining CFPB, Aissa served as a policy advisor for the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee under the leadership of former Chairman Tom Harkin and Chairwoman Patty Murray, where she worked on higher education, college access, and affordability issues. Prior to joining the staff of the Senate Health Committee, she worked for Senator Barbara Boxer. Aissa holds a bachelor's degree in political science and American studies from CSU Fullerton, where her passion for higher education policy and advocacy began. As a student leader, she helped lead the California State Student Association and helped spearhead campaigns to address the rising costs of college and the need to reinvest in public higher education. Aissa currently serves as the board of directors on the board of directors for the California State University DC Scholars Program, which provides professional development opportunities for students to study, live, and intern at the nation's capital. So as you see, we have some really amazing folks with us on the panel today. And with that, we'll go ahead and get it started. I know everyone's really excited to hear what panelists have to talk about. So the first question actually will go to Professor Glader. I know Jonathan has worked with partners across the UC system to students with institutional debts, including publishing a report in 2022 called Creditor Colleges. Can you give some more background about what institutional debt is, how it occurs, who it affects, and what tactics schools use to collect?
Sure. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that generous introduction. And thank you to everyone who's joined us online for today's conversation. So I'm going to offer just a brief explanation of institutional debt and identify some of its worrisome significance. We began exploring this topic almost 3 years ago during the pandemic for reasons that I think will become clear. Institutional debt, simply put, these are debts owed by students directly to institutions. So we can go to the next slide, please. So debts to the colleges, to community colleges, to the universities that students attend. They can include a wide range of expenses like fines for an overdue library book or for unpaid parking tickets or something like that. But they can also be created when a student withdraws from school, and that's what I will focus on here. When a student receives Title IV financial aid, such as a Pell Grant, Title IV refers to that section of the Higher Education Act that is created and governs federal student aid. If a student receiving that aid withdraws after attending for 60% or less of an enrollment period, like a semester, federal aid rules require colleges to return a portion of the student's aid to the Federal Department of Education. This policy is known as return of Title IV funds, again, referring to that section of the Higher Education Act. Most college and university employees probably don't know about this whole process, let alone its effects. When a student receiving Title IV aid, when a student withdraws then, and the school returns that federal aid that it received to help pay for a student's education, the college or university converts or can convert the cost of the education already received by the student into a debt owed by that student to the college or university. What was a federal grant paid by the US government, in other words, becomes a debt owed by the student directly to the institution, hence the name institutional debt. And this debt is arising because of the interplay of federal program design and standard practices of colleges and universities. It's worth emphasizing that because these are not federal student loans, the various repayment protections that federal student aid programs provide for borrowers do not apply. So can we go to the next slide, please? My brilliant colleagues, Charlie Eaton and Laurel Hamilton, who are sociologists at UC Merced, and Dalia Jimenez, who is a fellow law professor at the University of California, Irvine, found that hundreds of thousands of students ended up owing institutional debts as a result of leaving school during the pandemic. Our report on this research calculated that students accrued $195 million in these debts in the 2020 to 2021 academic year alone, and a comparable amount, or nearly the same amount, the following year. And our estimates are based on data that we obtained from 4 University of California campuses and 3 community college districts on institutional debts incurred in that financial aid year. We agreed when requesting data to refrain from identifying which institutions provided us the data. These numbers matter because typically students are barred from re-enrolling until they repay an institutional debt, even though, of course, this harms an institution's completion rates for students. So if a student, for example, anticipated earning higher wages after completion of a course of study, for example, their path to a degree gets more difficult as a result of institutional debts. They can't return to school to work towards that degree, which enables them to earn more, which enables them potentially to pay off the debt. California public colleges and universities also commonly place institutional student debts with for-profit debt collection agencies, and that can damage students' credit profiles and make it more difficult for them to borrow in the future. When we checked the websites of at least 7 UC campuses and 19 Cal State University campuses reported placing delinquent debts with debt collectors. If UC debts remain unpaid, students are likely to receive calls from one of a handful of debt collectors hired by the university to collect. And according to UC's contracts with debt collection agencies, the agencies are paid anywhere from 15 to 25% of what they collect on behalf of the school. One campus told us that only 17 to 19% of balances placed with collectors were in fact successfully collected from 2018-19 to 2020-2021. At least some public colleges and universities have also used the state's interagency intercept collections program to seize money from students' tax refunds through the state franchise tax board during the pandemic. So a student entitled, for example, to an earned income tax credit might find their payment reduced or consumed as a result of a college or a university's interception to repay one of these institutional debts. What makes this phenomenon particularly disturbing, beyond the barrier that institutional debts can pose to students trying to finish their courses of study and enter the labor market armed with this valuable new credential, is that it's regressive. Students who receive federal Pell Grants, for example, are high-need students, otherwise they would not be eligible for Pell Grants in the first place. So conversion of that federal grant aid into an institutional debt that disproportionately affects students who are least able to manage that additional burden, the student with the greatest financial need and with the higher level of financial precarity. More students, especially low-income students, are dropping out of college during COVID, likely due to multiple factors, including family care responsibilities, mental health challenges, basic needs insecurity, severe financial hardships, and of course, the pivot to remote instruction. So collection efforts by colleges and universities are disproportionately affecting the more vulnerable students. And the next speakers, I think, will say more about the consequences of this phenomenon and what perhaps can be done to reduce the financial and other harms that institutional debts can inflict, with an eye to enabling students to finish their courses of study and then have greater financial resilience to cope with this and any other financial challenges they face. Thank you again so much for including me.
Thank you so much, Professor Glader, for that overview on kind of the methods that schools have been using to collect and really the impact of it on students and how successful it really is as a means of collecting debt. I do want to just take a step back. I was so excited introducing our panelists. I did not introduce myself. Speaking to you today or moderating this panel is myself, Sada Abuabipsa. I'm the West Advocacy Manager with Young Invincibles. You've probably heard from my Executive Director, Kristen, not too long ago. And we're essentially a national nonprofit advocacy organization that tries to uplift the voices of young adults in the political process. And with that, we'll move on to our second question that we have here today. So Professor Glader kind of walked us through the data, the little data that we do have to paint the picture of what institutional debt crisis looks like in California. So the next question is really for Aisa and Sam. Let's dig into and really understand why this is a problem for students and institutions. Can you give us a little more info?
Yeah, thanks, Sada, and thank you, Professor. Just really want to dig through like why this is a real problem, that, you know, what we and other states can do, policy leaders, institution leaders, you know, what students, we really do need to address this issue, because at least in California, we have, you know, a couple of different persisting problems from the pandemic. As Professor Glader mentioned, this research was kind of born out of seeing what was happening on the ground for students. And at least in our state, we see a persisting issue of declining enrollments, like across the board, across all of our institutions, K through 12 through higher education. And so, that really has some possible dark consequences down the line when we talk about just our economy, our society impacts as a whole. And certainly we want to end the cycle of poverty for as many families and students as possible here in the state. And so we know through this work and with you all, with other partners and institutions, that this is, a problem that needs to be addressed. It has been identified as one of the main factors in this declining enrollment trend that we see, especially, at the higher education level, and of course, the consequences to our graduation rates coming down the line. And, in California, thanks to the leadership of our governor and our legislature, we have an ambitious goal to get to a certain level of degree completion, graduation rates here in the state. So when we have that vision for California, talking about institutional debt should certainly be a part of that concept of that formula. And so that speaks directly to those enrollment holds that Professor Glader mentioned, right? Literally stops a student from coming back to campus until they figure out their finances, frankly. And we know, and I know from personal experience, it doesn't just clear up after a month or, a week or, even one semester. Some life issue that came up, most likely unexpected, especially medical related, can take up someone's time. It could take up to a year, or two to like really get out of whatever issue has come up in your life. And so those enrollment holds until you can pay that debt off will literally stop a student. And we know that especially depending on a student's background, once they stop, it's very unlikely that they will come back. It makes it harder to just pause for one semester or 2 semesters or terms to come back. It's just increases the likelihood that they will just stop and, go into the workforce, and hopefully we get them back at some other point for returning learners, but that's not usually the case. And I know I won't take up all the time here. I know you have plenty to say on this as well.
No, thank you so much, Sam. Absolutely echo, just the severity of this issue and the fact that, as Professor Glader had mentioned, the report that Professor Glader and Professor Jimenez and their colleagues had put together was really couched in what we saw really kind of exacerbate over the course of the pandemic, right? So we saw many of our most vulnerable and low income families be disproportionately harmed, both through the health impacts, but also the economic impacts of the pandemic. We saw these students have to kind of withdraw from their coursework at record levels, and really kind of exacerbate the numbers of institutional debt that had been kind of growing across institutions of higher ed across California and across the nation. But the fact is that institutional debt had been an issue long before the pandemic. In 2020, it was estimated that over 6.6 million individuals owed about 15 billion in institutional debt. This is across the nation, right? And to Sam's point, when an institution kind of uses enrollment holds or other types of very, overtly harmful means to collect, these are many of the times, they are tactics that a traditional collector would not necessarily have at their disposal, right? If I can't pay my credit card bill, Chase can't keep me from continuing on and making progress towards my degree. And then once I'm actually able to get this degree and get gainful employment and actually be able to bring in more income, am I able to actually pay off this debt? And so what we are finding, and what's particularly unique about institutional debt, is that the people who are the collectors are the institutions, and they have tools at their disposal that can sometimes even be more harmful than what we see in the federal student loan space and in the private student loan space. So as Professor Glader had mentioned, with institutional debt, these are not loan products that are owed to a private bank or owed to the Department of Education. And therefore, a student or a recently dropped out former student does not have the rights to an affordable repayment plan as they would, let's say, if they were falling behind or struggling to keep up on their federal student loans. Schools have even been found to require the entire balance of an institutional debt to be due immediately, in some instances when a student we know is very unlikely to be able to pay off this debt. So we see kind of the fact that we have these creditors that are oftentimes, schools that are seen as a trusted institution, really kind of using some very harmful tactics, either using enrollment holds, using transcript holds, degree holds, to kind of prevent a student from being able to re-enroll or make progress towards their degree, or even just get their degree to get a job. But then we also see these schools using some of the worst economic kind of focused tactics to collect as well. So Professor Glader had mentioned, the use of third-party for-profit debt collectors, just kind of speaking to the consequences of what happens to someone when they are being referred to collections. If somebody is referred to collections, their collection agency can report the negative, make negative marks on your credit score. If your credit score gets dinged, that could impact an individual's ability to secure employment, to secure housing, sometimes to even secure, certain benefits. So that is also, when we're talking about the ways in which institutional debt not only hinders people's educational progress, but it also exacerbates economic inequities amongst our particularly most vulnerable communities. As Professor Glader had also mentioned, schools utilizing tax offset programs that are intended for public entities to collect on outstanding debts. Oftentimes, these are some of the tax benefits that are supposed to support our lowest income folks across California or across the nation. And so to know that some of the most critical tax benefits and resources that policymakers are trying to intend to support our most vulnerable families are being used to pay off these outstanding debts. It's really a policy conversation that has been long overdue. And thankfully, we have been able to have this conversation, or at least the beginning of this conversation here in California, and across many states too, where we've seen, states starting to take on transcript withholding. So transcript withholding is one of the most common ways that schools will withhold something from a student in order to collect on an outstanding institutional debt. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau last year put out guidance to schools that the use of transcript withholdings is considered a UDAP, an unfair and deceptive practice, because of the fact that the student is oftentimes required to show a transcript in order to secure employment and bring in revenues and bring in salary and income in order to pay off this debt. And so, when we saw the CFPB take this action, and actually it was in response to California legislation that had prohibited the practice, but we saw CFPB take a stance and make it clear that schools should try to refrain from engaging in this type of debt collection practice. And then we also saw the Biden-Harris administration kind of implement a new policy that would prohibit schools from being able to use transcript withholding for specific semesters that a student used Title IV aid, Title IV financial aid to purchase that education. So, the consequences are particularly dire, and that just kind of stresses the need for policy action, both at the state and federal level as well. So Sara, happy to turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Aisa, and thank you, Sam, for that really deep analysis as to why this is a really big problem for students and for institutions. So Aisa, it sounds like California has already started to address the institutional debts, but by being the first state to ban with transcript withholding that you've been talking about. But as Jonathan explained, the problem still persists. So what is the policy solution here?
Yes. So as we had mentioned, California has really been a leader here in reining in some of the worst practices or tactics that we've seen institutions use. So back in 2019, Assemblywoman Rivas had introduced AB 1313, which also had support from the Attorney General as well as ultimately and the governor. And that really made California the first in the nation to really outlaw any type of transcript withholding as a means to collect on institutional debt. Since then, more than 10 states have taken action through their state legislatures to either fully prohibit or limit instances when a transcript can be withheld from a student as a result of institutional debts. So that is great. And that is making a lot of progress. As I had mentioned, we've seen CFPB in the Biden administration also do certain thing in terms of like warning schools about the harms of this practice, but also limiting instances. But unfortunately, it's not enough. So as Professor Glader had mentioned, there's a host of tactics that schools use, and students ultimately pay the price, whether that's through not being able to complete their higher education, or whether it's the economic price that they have to pay by being subjected to collections or tax benefit offsets. And so that really, those other tools that many of the schools use was really the impetus behind AB 1160, which was introduced it was a 2-year bill. And I know Sam will provide all of the legislative kind of details on what happened in the last legislative session, but it really informed AB 1160 and made it the most comprehensive state legislative vehicle to respond to this particular phenomenon. And what the bill did was really kind of rein in some of these most harmful tools that schools are using, and also increase transparency around kind of where this debt is accumulating, who it's harming the most, and what some of the most common practices that schools are using. And to stress why action is so necessary now. So we had mentioned that our fabulous professors and researchers started to look into this over the course of the pandemic because we saw massive numbers of students having to drop out, whether that was because of health reasons or economic reasons. And many had to drop out to support their families, or sudden loss in the family, et cetera. Many schools over the course of the pandemic also started, they started to roll back some of the most harmful kind of tactics. So there were some schools across California in particular that said, we're going to voluntarily stop sending people to collections over the pandemic because it's absolutely egregious that we would be sending a student and their family into collections when we know that there is so much economic hurt and harm happening as a result of the pandemic. Many schools were receiving additional emergency aid from the federal government in order to support them and keep their doors open and make sure that we are providing supports to students to keep them enrolled or encourage them to get back onto campus and making progress towards their degree. Many of those practices and a lot of that resources, we are starting to see these practices starting up again now that the pandemic is behind us, and many folks are kind of ready to move on and start building, a path forward from there. We have started to take note that schools are starting to pick up these practices again, that a lot of the emergency resources that were once available to schools to give them emergency grant aid or anything of that sort to get them back enrolled and back on campus have since dried out or are expiring. And so we are heading into an era where students will have little to no protections, and many of the worst practices are going to be back on the table. And that is one of the reasons why we need to see state and national policymakers really take note of this crisis and take make it a priority to pass legislation in order to address it. And can you move to the next slide, please? And so what AB 1160 really aimed to do, as we had mentioned, was, looking to some of the worst practices that were harming students. So the bill had gone through several different iterations across the legislative process, but in its final iteration, the bill would have allowed students to re-enroll through a one-time kind of grace period, if you will, that would allow a student to re-enroll, get back on campus, get back on track, and over that time, get back in good standing with their school's financial aid office. And whether that is through repaying their institutional debt in full, or getting into a tuition or into a payment plan that was agreed upon between the student and the school. This would have really helped both. It would have been a win-win for students and for schools. As Sam had mentioned at the top, many institutions across California are really struggling with our re-enrollment rates for across the segments, and this would have helped get students back enrolled, back on campus, especially if many of them are, holding back on getting back enrolled because of an outstanding institutional debt. So the bill really looked at trying to find a middle ground. What can we do to get a student back enrolled, but also make it a point to pay back that debt that they owed, and then would have protected students from some of the worst of these tactics that we mentioned. So requiring a university to wait 180 days before subjecting a student to for-profit third-party debt collection. Why 180 days? Well, in California, there is a protection that the legislature had established for Californians with medical debt. And it requires hospitals to wait 180 days before subjecting a Californian with medical debt into private for-profit debt collection. We felt that students that are trying to also do whatever they can to invest in themselves and get back on track with their degree should have that same kind of window of protection before being subjected to collection. And then the bill would have also established a 2-year protection from that kind of tax offset that had been mentioned before. The 2-year protection was also informed by data that by national data that showed that within the first 3 years that a student stops out from their university, that window is the most likely that a student will be able to re-enroll. And after that 3-year window, it gets much, much harder to get somebody back on their college campus. And so our view, or the policy that we were trying to kind of push, was if you give the student the protection from this offset, particularly within the window of time when they're most likely to return, you are literally increasing all of the chances to get the student back on track, to get them, to get them into a position where they can repay this debt and ultimately on the pathway to earning their degree. And then finally, the bill would have also increased transparency. So, Professor Glader and his colleagues submitted several data requests across institutions. And I know that took a lot of time. And the reason they had to do that is because across our state and across the nation, there is no kind of comprehensive data collection that allows us to understand, us as the public, us as policymakers, us as advocates, to understand how many students are owing institutional debt, how many schools are actively funneling people and their students into collections, in the same way that we have comprehensive and robust data within our federal student loan space. And because of that, many students, families, advocates, and policymakers are left in the dark. And so AB 1160 would have required the public segments of higher ed, the community colleges, and the CSU would have been required, and the UC would have been kind of requested to report comprehensive data across their campuses on, the number of students that owe an institutional debt, and the types of debt collection policies that they have on the books, to really allow policymakers to kind of wrap our heads around what is happening in this space. unlike the $1.7 trillion student debt crisis that has kind of dominated the news over the last decade, institutional debt has largely kind of been in the shadows. And so that's why we call it shadow student debt. And it is one of the reasons why we think it has grown so pervasive and so dangerous for students across the country.
Thank you so much, Aisa, for that in-depth recap onto as to what AB 1160 does. And with that, I'll pass it over to Sam to kind of briefly go over the recent legislative session, who supported the bill, who opposed it, and what the legislature thought of this proposal.
Sure. Yeah. And thank you, Aisa, for breaking it down. You know, what you shared was kind of, like you said, the end result of what we ended up with for the legislation. And even at that form, it is still a very ambitious bill, right? The first iteration that was presented or introduced, highly ambitious. So we did see strong opposition to the legislation, and kind of what we've been hearing from, you know, what our DFPI commissioner said at the top, that this is going to be a long fight, right? And our panelists across the today's summit has talked about, you know, hurdles whenever we're fighting for reforms. And so we certainly face those hurdles, special interests such as, you know, debt collector associations and others who have a interest in seeing debt out there for their industry were opposed, and, you know, definitely exercise their influence in the legislature, which, you know, means that we got to combat that with our people power. We have to show up in those hallways, and you know, if you can't make it to Sacramento, you got to call your representative, you got to email them, text, post, you know, reach your representative to let them know that you think this is a problem. Share your story if you can, to really fight back on those special interest voices. And you know, we did also see opposition from our higher education institutions. And I think the backdrop and fight there is just, we need to make sure that that the solutions we put forward is something that's workable. And we do want to push our institutions to test their own boundaries, to really stay student focused. We understand that there is, you know, a kind of a reality of operating, but I think in California, we've demonstrated time and time again that our institutions can step up and have really student-centered policies, programs, and support systems in place. And I think as Aisa and Professor Glader both touched on, you know, we know that that's the case because the institutions have shown in the past that they were able to make do without some of these most harmful debt collection practices. And so in the whole, you know, or the conversation with the legislature certainly continues. I think the conversation will continue with, you know, how do we make this work? How do we see that this is a win-win, you know, for students, our enrollment, graduation goals, and for institutions, against a backdrop of kind of a harsh economic reality. And part of what happened in the past 2 years was a very hard California state budget landscape, which, you know, kind of shadowed everything and every aspect of the work of the legislature. So as much as California does try to push the envelope, there is some boundaries that we do need to be aware of and work, you know, in concert with. And so we had a bad budget downturn here in the state for the last 2 years. We do expect that to continue for at least another year. And, you know, lots of question marks with the incoming federal administration as well, and what that could do for California policies. But all that to say is that, you know, one thing that we did learn is that we did get that very ambitious bill very close to the end there, right? And so the fiscal committee was where it ended up in the second house in our state Senate. But that just means that we know that this is something that our legislators do care about. And it's kind of just finding that fix of how do we make this work across the board. So, you know, I know that all of us here and those on the Campaign for California Borrowers' Rights Coalition that we were proud to stand with, who were either in strong support and co-sponsors of the bill. You know, that included students, student borrowers, you know, advocates, and other community college leaders standing with us to say that, yes, this is an issue that needs to be addressed and we're going to keep fighting for it. So I think that just speaks to the work continues in the next years ahead, as Aisa said.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. And thank you, Aisa, also for giving us a deep dive into AB 1160, and Sam kind of letting us know what schools can, what some issues that our institutions had and kind of the special interest groups had with the bill itself. So we'll go over to Professor Glader. Sam and Jonathan in particular, can you tell us about what colleges can do to enact change on their own? Are there any colleges that have already started addressing the issue?
Sure. I mean, so these are debts to the institution. The institution can decide whether to pursue them or not. So there are certainly some institutions that have decided, no, we're not going to pursue students to collect the 17 to 19 cents on the dollar. That is the what we're told is the typical recovery. They can also choose to let students re-enroll, so which also increases the likelihood, as I tried to make clear, if students are able to re-enroll, then they are more likely to complete, more likely to earn a higher income as a result of achieving whatever credential they get, and then they're going to be better able to pay off whatever institutional debt it is. Remember, the dollar amount need not be huge to still serve as a barrier for the student. So it is likely a better deal for the institution to help the student finish and help the student get the employment they're seeking by means of that credential, so that it's more likely this student will repay the obligation in the long run. So yeah, the institution, once it becomes the debtor, has options.
Yeah, and I'll just add in that, some of the examples that we saw, some of our most innovative community colleges, especially, that in one case, in the San Francisco region, took it on themselves to find additional local funding in order to, kind of forgive that debt, make themselves whole, and make sure that students knew that they could come back to campus. And they saw a bump in that enrollment. So we know again that this is a re-enrollment strategy to end institutional debt collection practices like this. And other colleges across the state can, specifically community colleges, have had the chance to do the same, because the state, again, recognized that this was a problem, put state funding behind a grant program to community colleges specifically, but to do exactly just that, what happened in San Francisco. Take this pot of state funding, use it as a re-enrollment tactic, wipe the debt out for students so that they could come back, and tell them to come back. And so, certainly it's been recognized again that this is a winning strategy for institutions. And another quick example, CSU. We had one CSU campus. Sorry, I can't give out the shout out. I can't remember the name of the campus exactly, but they did also put a program together to work with students. So they were actively reaching out to students and checking their records and working through what was happening, and able to get at students to like emergency financial aid funding that was pretty available from the federal government during the pandemic. And certainly California has done our share in emergency aid as well.
And if I can add one more piece, I mean, I know we're talking about instances where schools completely stopped resorting to these types of collection tactics and found funds to wipe away the outstanding institutional debt. But those are particularly the best case scenarios, right? But even when a school just allows the student to re-enroll and works with the student to get on a tuition, a payment plan of sorts, our fabulous research colleagues did an economic analysis of AB 1160 and found that by just allowing a student to re-enroll, getting them back onto campus, allowing them to bring more financial aid and more Pell Grant resources to the campus, by just enrolling 33% of students in 1 year, an institution could raise $214 million in additional tuition revenues. So one of the things that we constantly were having to combat were, institutions saying, we are in an incredibly difficult budget, climate right now. There's no way that we could possibly allow a student with an institutional debt to get back on campus. How would we ever be able to collect this money. But we were trying to tell them by actually allowing them to get back on campus and working with them to get on a tuition plan or a payment plan, you could in fact bring more revenues in so that you have more resources to serve your students. And I think that is an argument that we're going to continue to have to make, just considering the budget climate across several states, to be honest. But, you know, as we are thinking about, you know, demanding more for students, demanding more for families with student debt, you know, it's always a convenient argument that, oh, there's just no resources. How could we possibly cancel student debt? How could we possibly allow students to re-enroll and, you know, continue to make progress towards their degree? It's always used within this, like, you know, resource constraint, you know, perspective. And, you know, these particular policies would help these schools bring in additional revenues. And so I just wanted to bring up that point, because schools don't even have to completely abandon these practices. Just getting students back in the door can help them, help the students and the schools.
Thank you so much for that, Aisa. Thank you, Sam and Professor Glader, for all of your insights onto what schools can do now, and kind of combating the really pervasive narrative that these debt collections have to happen before students can re-enroll, and kind of that missed opportunity for future revenues. So far we've discussed the importance of institutional debt and how its overlooked impacts will continue to harm California students. Professor Glader has taken us through the breadth of the problem. Aisa has walked us through the deep impact that AB 1160 would have on this issue. And Sam has kind of given us some key insights into how the legislative session went for this proposal. Now for this question's for everyone on the panel. Where do we go from here? What institutional debt is still an issue, and it's only one part of a system that has several issues. What should we be trying for in the future and in 2025 in particular?
I'm happy to start. You know, I think we really need to push for more transparency in the institutional debt space in particular. I think one of the challenges that we had was really we didn't have comprehensive data in order for policymakers to really dig into and really wrap their head around why this is happening and how it's harming students. And so I think we still have our work to do in order to further define the problem. You know, our researchers have already found that this is an issue. It is having a disproportionate impact on our most vulnerable students. But I think we do need to see more comprehensive data. And so having legislation that requires schools to report on this in the same way that they report on several other important, you know, aspects in order to be transparent about student outcomes and things of that sort. I think that would be really helpful. And I think it would also help us in our narrative building around the issue just writ large. And that's something that would not take a significant amount of resources in a particularly challenging budget climate either.
If I can jump in, I would just double down on the point that was made a moment ago about the virtues of allowing students to re-enroll. I think that's something that's not necessarily, it doesn't depend on legislation or any other kind of action, just recognition that it is to the benefit of the student who owes the institutional debt and the institution to which the student owes it, to enable the student to re-enroll and complete. I mean, this is not that complicated. There are some problems that are enormously complicated. This one is relatively straightforward.
I completely agree with that. Echo both of you. And do want to encourage our better actors out there to please keep doing that work and push your colleagues to do that work too. We know that this is something that could be solved relatively quickly with the right leadership in the right spots, right? And so I think going forward towards 2025, and for all of you listening into the summit, please, again, call to action here. Contact your representatives. They need to hear that this is an actual problem, not just from us, not just, that it's not a problem from special interests, but it is solvable and that this needs to be done. And so, you'll hear this time and time again. It is calling your representative, telling them your story, activating other family members or friends who might have had this experience as well. Many times too, we hear that this collection goes on many years after a student has either left or graduated, even up to 8 to 10 years, and suddenly they get another bill and you've been out for so long. So this is definitely something that I think a lot of us, we can't let fall by the wayside, despite everything else that's going on. This is something that, again, we need to pull together, build a greater, more diverse coalition to show who this really impacts across the board. We know that debt is, it has ramifications beyond just the person with the debt, for their families, for their communities. And again, with the impacts of what's happening here in California, for California's enrollment numbers, our economy down the line, in our society. And so, yes, we will be bringing this on our part, continue our commitment to bring this issue to the forefront, so that it doesn't get lost in some of the other discussions here. But we remain committed to this.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam, Aisa, and Professor Glader. Thank you all for providing some really beautiful and important insights into how much of a problem this is, particularly because it's not being addressed. We talk about it as a shadow student debt, but so many students don't even know that this falls under a type of student debt, right? Students who kind of see, why do I have this hold? What's going on? Oftentimes don't know that there are ways to address it, and ways that they can kind of speak to their school to get back on track as well. So with that, those were our final questions for the panelists here. We want to thank them so much for their time and for joining us today. We will open it up for Q&A. If there are any questions, I see one here in the chat. This question is, are you researching the national economic benefits of government-funded higher education? So I'm assuming this question's supposed to be going to Professor Glader, but also Aisa and Sam, if you have any insights on this, please feel free to answer. The question again is, are you researching the national economic benefits of government-funded higher education?
Yeah, that's a little beyond my area. I focus more on equity and access and sort of the implications of education policy for equity and access. There are economists who have tried to do exactly what you're describing and try to quantify what are the economic or financial gains from the investment in higher education, not just for the individual student, who is more likely to earn a higher income following completion of a program of higher education, but for the wider community. And the book that I always go to, I don't think it's visible behind me, but is a book by a guy named Walter McMahon called Higher Education, Greater Good. And the interesting findings of the book is that if you look at all of the indirect financial benefits beyond the individual student that result from achievement of higher education, we should be investing more in accessibility of higher ed to achieve more of the shared benefits.
Yeah, and if I could also just add on, not that we're doing the research here, but I just want to note that that kind of question is very helpful. And to any of our research partners, listening in and joining us in the summit, we would be happy to see some of that research in the future. And I know the conversation in California too is one, we're lucky here that we are having a conversation about the total cost of college beyond just tuition and books, right? It even is, with our efforts here, putting forth institutional debt as part of the realities of the cost of going to a higher education institution. And so I can at least maybe try my best to represent the higher education community here in California. But this question about, you know, the total cost of college is being researched, is being talked about, is being discussed continually. You know, and especially what is our return on investment from some of our support systems with students. And you know, how do we get to a true debt-free college pathway here in California? I would say, you know, at minimum, at least we're having that conversation. I know students and others are talking about, you know, completely free college, but we do want to, you know, through an equity lens, recognize students, specific populations who have been continually left out of higher education due to policy decisions, right? Whether or not intended, we are, you know, this is one area where there have been decisions, policy or otherwise, by institutions that we are now raising the alarm that this is the ramification that's happening. It is disproportionately, institutional debt disproportionately impacts lower income students. A lot of our Pell Grant recipients, and we know that likely falls along communities of color as well. So this is another barrier to some of these historically, you know, marginalized or left behind communities that we do want. Certainly, I know our state really puts a high market price on that. So, you know, this is an unintended consequence of what's happening that is contradictive of what California is striving to do. And so definitely, again, call to arms for any of our researcher friends and allies out there. Please take a look at this, share your data. It absolutely helps with fighting the good fight in the halls of power. So we definitely need more data and research done.
Yeah, and if I could just add one piece, because I'm all for, you know, data showing the economic returns on an investment around higher education. But I also think it's critical for us as a nation to talk about the need to having a strong kind of higher education system that is helping to create critical thinkers in our country and helping to strengthen our democracy and protect our democratic like institutions across the country too. And so, yes, absolutely, higher education as a means to economic advancement for sure, but also in order to create a democracy with people who are able to think critically and engage with one another and talk about critical issues in this country, I think is also incredibly important. And so I think if there are research partners out there doing those critical, or like researching those critical questions as well, I think we definitely welcome all of them.
Thank you so much, Aisa and Sam and Professor Glader for those insights. I will add a small thing here. Back when I was in community college, we actually worked on the Free City College campaign to make City College of San Francisco free to residents, and that did go through. And we are finding that the city of San Francisco is doing just fine, even though City College of San Francisco is free. There are ways that institutions can and education can be funded, and we do see that salaries are maintained for staff and faculty, and the school operates just fine and continues to stay afloat and be successful and maintain its large number of students. And City College of San Francisco is not a small college. From any time, it has between 30 and 50,000 students enrolled. So it is a large community college system. So just wanted to add that little tidbit in there, that there are some cases where it is being done, and I think those cases just need to be elevated and promoted in other areas around the country as well. But thank you so much for that question. We are coming up at time for our panel, so just want to thank one more time the panelists for their intentionality in kind of addressing the questions and the issues at large. I want to thank Professor Glader and his colleagues who are working on this key research and shedding light on the importance of institutional debt and how imperative it is that our institutions address it, especially since we in California tend to think of ourselves as the leader when it comes to a wide range of issues, especially higher education. It's critical for us to continue to push our institutions to do the work to protect students, as well as our legislators to kind of put their money where their mouth is when it comes to higher education and protecting students. And I think we can definitely do that with all of your support. So please do stay tapped into the work that we are doing with the Campaign for California Borrowers' Rights in the coming years, especially next year. And you can definitely work with us to share your story around institutional debt, and we'd be happy to elevate it. I'm going to tap you into speaking to your representatives as well. With that, I'll pause here and pass it over to Sam again. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Sarah, and thanks my fellow panelists. That concludes this panel. So I'll be talking to you all soon. So with that, yes, again, and thank you all for sticking around for a deep dive into relatively new topic of institutional debt. Many thanks again to our panelists and Sarah for guiding us.